And welcome to Straight Talk Live. It's great to be with you again on this Thursday morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world listening to this show. So, my name is Rick Snyder. I'm one of the co hosts of Straight Talk Live. I'm the CEO of Invisible Edge. I am the culture officer at Refound and the author of Decisive Intuition. And I am joined by one of my incredible cohorts and colleagues in this life, Af Malhotra. You are an incredible partner in this mindset of Straight Talk Live and creating this amazing opportunity with me and our audience. So, welcome, Af. What would you like to share about today and what you're excited about for this topic?
Thank you, Rick. Welcome to the audience again. We've got two fantastic guests on our show today, and before I started Growth Enabler, where I'm a co-founder, as you guys know, and this whole idea of StraightTalk.Live came about, I was in the corporate world for a number of years, and one of my old friends from the corporate world happens to be on the show today. So very excited to have Remy and Guy on the show today. I'm particularly interested in this subject. I had an opportunity, thanks to Remy actually, 3.5 years ago, to go and present on robotics. I had very limited knowledge on it, and I had to quickly upgrade my knowledge. And I went all the way to, I think it was San Jose, and we presented at Robo Business. And there were some incredible brains and minds in that show. In fact, Ray Kurzweil was one of the keynote speakers, the guy behind Singularity, and of course we have a collaboration with Singularity in London as well. So today's topic is close to my intellectual sort of vibrations and my heart, because as a friend of AI, I think robotics and robots and AI live together. They're dependent on each other. They have a very close personal relationship. But AI has been talked about a lot more than robotics has and robots have. And I think today is an opportunity to really unpack that and talk about it in a lot of detail. So without further ado, let's crack on, Rick, and over to you to set the scene, and let's get into the core of this conversation.
When I think about the future, I sometimes go back to the past of George Jetson, the old TV show from the 50s and 60s, where you see people flying around in these robotic machines and traveling in the skies. And then you imagine it's not that far away when you think about
Yeah.
drones and drone activity and what the highways might look like in the future, and different sky territories and however that looks. What if we're not that far away? And what does that even look like to have robotics at the head of supply chains where things are breaking down and being exposed today, from COVID and all the areas where we have a lot of obvious places where we're not, there's no infrastructure, we're not connected like we thought, when there's a crisis. So we have two leading experts in the field of robotics that I'm very excited to introduce to you today on Straight Talk Live. And so I'm going to have you gentlemen introduce yourselves. We have Remy Glasner and Guy Corton. And so, gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk Live.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Very glad to be here today.
Thanks, Rick. Looking forward to it.
Okay. Why don't we start with you, Guy? Could you tell us a little bit about your background and also what interests you about robotics and robots? Like, what was your connection to this whole field of study?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, Rick. And really looking forward to spending the next hour with you guys. So again, my name is Guy Cortin. I work at Six River Systems currently, but I've been in supply chain for the past 20 years. I started out my career back at Forrester Research back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I got sort of a front row seat to the first explosion of technology, that dot-com boom, and then really got into supply chain. Really felt that supply chain was one of the underlying reasons why a lot of the dot-coms failed. And fast forward to today, I think we're seeing automation and robotics really go hand in hand with supply chain. And I think Af also mentioned it's sort of the AI side. So I think it's been a really interesting play, so to speak, for my interest and my business and where I work. And I think that, when we look at automation, what's exciting for me is I think that in 5 years, we're going to think of automation as we do now with computation, right? It's just going to be part of our lives, and we'll just see it. So I think it's really interesting, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. How about for you, Remy?
Well, so how did I get into robotics? That's actually a great question. It was by mistake, I would say. I happen to be some kind of engineer in automation or something like that, by training, even if I never really practiced about it. And as Aftab was mentioning, I spent several years with a company called Gartner, in like research and advisory world. And toward the end of my time there, I was working with large clients in the US, telco clients, not to mention any of them. And what happened is I started to get like those questions from those people saying, well, to sustain our business, our wireless business, we're thinking about cell phone, then smartphone, then tablets. And they were asking, could robots be the next thing? And at the time, Gartner, they plenty of big head knowing a lot of things. I said, well, I don't know about that. Let me ask in the background and see what's going on. And it turned out that I realized at the time, that was nearly 10 years ago, no one was actually covering robotics in the way that a Gartner of the world would do. So by that I mean bring a vision for what robotics could become. So robots were already in use here and there. It was still the beginning, and somehow, arguably, it's still the beginning. But robotics, really, what the vision should be for robotics, no one was doing that. And so I guess I kicked my butt and decided to just jump in and realize that was a fantastic world. Again, like from my original background, I knew a little bit about it. And since then, I guess it's almost 10 years, I never left them. And I think it's really an amazing field with like so many new players popping up every day, a lot of creativity, a lot of new things going on. So it's very exciting, and I'm very happy to be in robotics for that reason.
We've been using this term robots and robotics. Could you just, for our audience, help with it, unpack both of those? How are they different? Because I think a lot of times I don't even think they're different. So could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, sure. And Guy might have also a point of view about that. So first off, like, the idea of robots and robotics, those two terms have been used really interchangeably, one with the other. The way it's not define it, but the way I would say the audience should probably like think about it is robots, it's a device, it's a machine, it does something, okay? Robotics include robots plus other layers of technology. So you can think about AI, you can think about software, all the supporting technology and supporting infrastructure, like the digital infrastructure that goes around the robots. All that create robotics. So robotics is basically very, very broad. You don't necessarily have to know so much about robots to actually be in robotics. That's kind of how I define it. And if you think about robots, I make that joke all the time, is if you have 10 people to think what a robot is, people will have 10 completely different perspective on what it looks like, the form factor and everything. When you think about robotics, and this is why I tend to refer more to it as robotics, it doesn't matter what the robot or the different kind of robot looks like. It's, you think about it as a system that is here to accomplish not only just a series of tasks, but really create value for a company, people, and you name it.
Yeah, I would just follow on what Remy said. I think it's a very good definition. I would just say, for those people to think about it too, is, and I'll take this from a mentor of mine, Dr. Raina Bradley, who's at the University of Tennessee, and he made the comment of, if you take a step back and you think about the digital world we live in, right? There's the mechanical side, and that might be the robots, and then there's the digital side, which the robotics fits into, exactly how Remy was saying. So I think it's really, the mechanical versus the digital aspect of robots and robotics.
Good stuff. I'm going to chime in if that's okay. And there's so many questions that are playing on our minds. Just to give you both some context, last couple of Straight Talk Live sessions have been about a combination of things. One part has been related to the pandemic and the psychological impacts of the pandemic, how to deal with uncertainty, how to build a resilient mind, how to be a leader who's ready for tough times and chaos, and so on and so forth. And we're starting to realize, as part of our manifesto, the theme that's shouting out really loud and drawing us in is a lot to do with the self, and that's a big part of the StraightTalk.Live sort of agenda. So I want to start off with the most sort of intriguing question. I don't think it's provocative. I think it's intriguing. And it's to do with us as people. And many friends and family members and audiences have said, are robots going to be a central part of mental well-being? Are they going to be the friend we always wish to have, bearing in mind we can't meet people face to face? A robot, thankfully, cannot get COVID. Do you see the relationship of a personal robot at home being part of a future somewhere? I don't know how many years down the line. So talk us through that. And we've watched it in Hollywood movies and in movies like Her. where I think Joaquin Phoenix had a relationship with this AI, which was robotics, I guess, software-based robotics. So tell us a little bit about your personal opinion as experts in this domain as to what this field is about. Is this hype, or are you going to just be real with us and tell us where we're going to end up? So maybe Guy, I don't know if you want to start, and we'll hand it to Remy then.
I think after you make an interesting point, I thought about this too. Let's go back to Blade Runner, right? Is it a human or is it a robot?
A replica.
So we've been looking at this issue and be well beyond that. And I think it's an interesting question. I think it sort of belies sort of a larger question about, our society and how we interact and how we, as humans build relationships and things of that nature. And obviously now with technology, whether it's robotics, social media, cell phones, laptops, the digital network that we all are part of. So I like to believe that, at some point, the human still needs human interaction. And while we can supplement some of it with automation, that the reality is that we, still need to have these types of interactions. I'll sort of use an interesting statistic that I've been looking at, and it's a little bit sideways of robotics, but I think it belies what we're talking about here. E-commerce growing big time because of COVID, right? Part of it is because we're stuck at home. We have to shop online. And if you look at some of the numbers when the economy started reopening here in the United States a bit, there was a huge push of people shopping at Kohl's and Target and all this, right? Why? Because they wanted to go back out. They wanted to have that human interaction. They recognized that e-commerce, yes, was important, but it was a part of their lives, but not their whole part. So I think the same thing with automation, at least I hope. I think that we will potentially, yes, we will see more robots, automation, digital technologies coming into our lives and potentially filling what we perceive as a gap in our life. I think there's some good there, but with that, there's also some negative, right? We disconnect, we don't understand what true human interaction is. So I think philosophically, maybe I'm being too optimistic or hopeful, where I hope that we hit a certain plateau where we recognize as humans that, we still need to go and have a beer with our mates and, have coffee and spend time with our families. And yes, there is a social and an emotional aspect of it where it could fulfill a gap. But my hope is that, we find a way to make sure that it doesn't overwhelm. But I can absolutely see us going off that cliff, and it at times it is kind of scary. And unfortunately, I don't have that crystal ball to be able to tell everybody, don't worry, we'll still be okay. Like maybe we do become Blade Runner.
Mm-hmm. We have. I just want to interject, make one point to add color to what you've said. For any of us who have grandparents or people in our family who are slightly elderly, there is, especially these days, there's a lot of concern, and God forbid, the person is alone. One passed away, the other one's alone, either in a care home or at home. This whole idea of telemedicine, IoT-based healthcare monitoring and so on is important. But I also find that depression and all of the other mental sort of challenges that you have when you're alone in a bed watching television all day, I almost think, sometimes the use case for having some sort of a companion who has AI and software built into them and has monitoring capabilities, but is not a square box on the corner of the room, but actually can interact with it or has a more of an immersive, interactive value. In certain communities, I actually think it could be a good thing. So I hear you, but just for the audiences listening there, these are real life problems. These are real life problems, and human beings alone can't solve them. And we're trying, but it's not always possible. So I wonder, I always think about robots actually helping people who need help the most at that particular time. Not the Terminator example, but the one I've shared. Remy, what do you think? What are your thoughts on it with your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question actually, and something that has been up for a while. Whenever they talk about those kind of robots going, to elderly places, like interacting with people that make the headline of, I don't know, BBC, CNN, or anything, like, because it's cool. I would just get back to what Guy was saying before, and agreeing with him that at the end of the day, people still need interaction with people. That robots will never. I don't think any technology will ever replace that. Just we are animals. We need to have other interaction with other animals. So technology has its limit. Now back to what you were saying. I don't know if today's generation of senior people is really necessarily ready for that, for to have like a machine like around them to really interact with them. It might come later, as you know, all the millennials are getting older and older. But and maybe some generation before that. But one thing that still is important in what's happening right now is we are actually experiencing some kind of shift in the digital world from anything was so far on the screen. You could hear it, you could see it, but you could not really touch it. And robotics, I think, in a way, is bringing that. So do I need to have a companion that will look like a human being to sit with me? Maybe not. But can robot actually bring in the cycle, like something you can interact with, by touching it or by, I don't know, smelling it or doing other things, like just using all of your senses and not just, hearing and speaking. I think there, robotics might have a play and could potentially become something that will really complement very, very well what, the real warmth of human being interaction is already bringing today.
Are there any companies out there in the personal sort of robotic space that you can think of that we should be aware of? We'd love to get them on our show, of course. But you're both in that world. Are there any? Is there any pioneering organization or a set of companies who are really getting out there and saying, do you know what, the future of the next 5 to 7 years is saying that you need one of these in your house? The only example I can think of, maybe it's telling, but when I was much younger, if you remember out of Japan, we had these Tamagotchis that came about, those little things, and it was like a LCD display. And believe it or not, I think I wasn't as addicted, but a lot of my friends were. Like they used to like feed it, and I don't know, they were like, "Oh my god, I've got to do this to this, take care of my Tamagotchi." It was like a keychain. Human beings are just very interesting. We have interesting ways of behaving. Do you think there are companies out there who are really taking this to the next level that you can talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, back to Japan again. SoftBank Robotics, the robotics arm is, with their robot Pepper. They've been in the news recently again about that, like trying to put like those robots who are kind of like, arguably something looking vaguely like a human. It's got a head, like 2 cameras and things. It's still a lot in my perspective, and it's not actually saying anything wrong, that anything is wrong about what they're doing, but it's still like a lot of like a tablet, on wheels. But those kind of things do exist. And actually most of the research that is done right now about like those interactions with robots, like, at a personal level, a lot come from Asia, Japan, Korea. But actually something that Guy might be able to talk about too is people think about it as, the personal relationship you got with the robot, personal relationship at home, but it does also exist in the, say, industrial world. Like how do you include robots in some sort of gamification solution that will actually help worker like be more engaged and, don't feel like, okay, robots are now kind of taking my job or doing my job. Is like, it's actually a real interaction. It's something pretty big right now. I don't know if Guy, you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think, from the professional or the, business world, I think we're seeing more robotics being, interspaced, interfused into whether it's warehouse, whether it's transportation, whether it's last mile fulfillment, whether it's manufacturing, and leveraging that. I guess for me, and it's funny, I think, Rick, you mentioned this in the beginning, right? You talk about the Jetsons, right? We all think about the robots as, from the Jetsons, and it looks kind of like a human and interact. But I think the reality is, and also Remy said this, right? You ask 10 people to draw a robot and you'll get 12 different pictures. I think we need to think about the same way, right? So if we look at, some of the robotics that we're seeing in the warehouse and fulfillment space, you're going to look at it and say, that's a robot, and it just looks like like an automated vehicle or what have you, right? It's not. It doesn't have arms. It doesn't have it's not talking to you. It doesn't look like the Terminator. So I think there's sort of this chasm between, right, the science fiction notion of the robots and what the real robots are that are out there. And to your question, Af, like some of these robots now are becoming, yes, they're there to help do your work. They're there to help you do things like move heavy, pallets and things of that nature. But I think they're also there to, help the human sort of, for lack of a better term, be able to do their job more effectively, but also in a way more enjoyably, right? It's not the monotony of just doing it. It's like, hey, we're going to, and we can talk about gamification. I certainly have different philosophies on what gamification really means, but this notion of, all right, let's let the machine, the robot, encourage that worker to do something that, you know, has some gamification. So it's more pleasant. It's easier. It's less, you know, rote work. But I think it's, you know, we're seeing that and we're seeing that more, but I think people always, in a way, in the mass public, we think of, oh, well, it's going to robot. It's going to look like me. It's going to walk around. It's going to make my coffee. It's going to, you know, run the vacuum. It's going to take the dog out for a walk, and it's going to, you know, talk to me like a human. All right. Well, you know, maybe someday we get there, maybe we don't, but we have to realize, I think, that we're seeing robotics and automation in our everyday lives already, both at work and as a consumer, and we don't even realize it.
You know, I've gotten to see this up closely. I've gotten to coach 2 businesses that have smart factories, and they literally have this seamless integration of these automated machines and humans doing the work in these labs and what have you. And it just becomes second nature. You know, after a while, it's just part of the job, and you see these machines going by hauling product, and you know to not get in that lane, and the humans are in the other lane, and it just kind of works because you just get used to it like anything.
All right, Rick, I was going to say, I think we think about, you know, let's go backwards. You say, let's go back 20, 30, 40 years, right? When the computer came out, and I was like, oh my goodness, the computer. And then all of a sudden, you know, Texas Instrument gave us this calculator we could use, and it was amazing, right? Nowadays, we walk around with a supercomputer in our pocket. We don't think twice. Like we don't think about the fact that, oh my goodness, I've got this amazing processing power. I've got this access to this thing called the internet. I've got fast speed of video and things. That's all computation. That's all computers. We don't think about it anymore, right? We just think, oh, let's go this app and look up, you know, X, Y, and Z.
Let me ask you this, like with COVID and pandemic, one of the things that we get to see on this show is we're seeing a lot of the future in cutting edge areas of so many different domains of life. And that's really exciting for us to get to. That's what we're trying to bring our audience, you guys out there. And so what I want to ask you 2 gentlemen, is one of the common denominators we see is that the pandemic is a great accelerator. It's accelerating the speed of where we need to adapt, where we need to go, and how we need to be smarter about that. What are you seeing in terms of acceleration in the robotics field? What's catching your attention right now that maybe wasn't the case 6 months ago?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think what's been really interesting is when we see, and I see, you know, this pandemic, what it's done is it's moved up the variable of safety, health, right? And it was always there with automation because, you know, in the past it was, hey, would you want to pull a 200-pound cart up and down the aisle every day in a warehouse, or do you want the robot to do it, right? That's the one that we always, you know, your back, your knees, and all this. But now we're certainly seeing a lot more where people, because of COVID, they have to think about, how do I keep my employees safe? How do I keep my employees distant? How do I help sanitize potentially, you know, my workplace? Can a robot help me do that? So instead of having someone have to go up and down aisles, you know, every 2 hours and spray disinfectant, maybe I have a robot that does that. Maybe I have a robot in my store that can help gauge people's health. You know, we can get into the whole question of privacy and all that, but, you know, could you see something, yes, where a robot is, you know, Af and Rick and Guy and Remy walk in and they all say, all right, you got to stop, and this robot's going to take your temperature and things of that nature, and then help, again, sanitize it afterwards. But I think we're seeing the acceleration of folks recognizing that the robot is complementary to labor, and that the robot can actually, amongst all the other things it can do beforehand, now with COVID, this notion of, hey, keep my labor safe, keep my keep my place sanitized, let me, you know, keep people separated by 6 feet plus. All of a sudden now there's a tool that can automate that process. And I think we're certainly, at least I am, seeing a lot of enthusiasm or accelerants in that space because of COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, I agree with what Guy was saying. And I would say, like, in terms of acceleration, I think robotics, it's even different. Robotics were there before the pandemic. There were solutions. I don't think the solutions, like, over the past 6 months have completely changed or are completely so different. But what was driving the market toward robotics was different things. One was constantly mentioned, some kind of macro trend, which was labor challenge. It wasn't even like, oh, people are too expensive. It's we cannot necessarily find the people to do the job. And for that, I'm talking about, like, you know, fulfillment center in e-commerce, production line in manufacturing, those kind of things. So it was already there, but it was kind of spread out. It was not completely even. And I would say arguably a lot of people could not completely feel it in the sense that, okay, maybe at the local and tactical level in that warehouse or that plant, I am actually experiencing like lacking the staff to do the job. But it wasn't necessarily everywhere. And all of a sudden with the pandemic, the question is not, do you have the staff potentially around? Is I cannot actually work with people. So, but still, I still need to produce things. I still need to move things around. And as much as possible, I need to almost remove the human component out of it. So suddenly people turn around and said, well, we have to do something. So automation, to a point, it's great. Like we got that, in the digital and I would say virtual world. Now we need to move that to the operational side of it. So like do things in real life, in the physical world. And, the example like Amazon Robotics, powering all the most of the Amazon warehouses where already like hundreds and thousands of robots are moving around and doing part of the job. All of a sudden, that was already an example. But all of a sudden, people realize, well, actually, we have no other choice. We have to move there. We have to do it. So what it did was suddenly first that realization that we must actually consider robotics. It's not necessarily move like full speed ahead there, but we must consider it. And I would say it also we must consider it, but it wasn't just coming from, say, warehouse manager or plant manager. It's actually spreading across organization, across people. It's like for many more people, it starts to make sense. It's not just about automation. It's not just about incremental improvement of whatever you're doing. It's about business continuity. It's about either I do that or it might just not exist in months from now. And so I have to implement that and I have to do that quick. So I think that, yes, it's an acceleration in many ways, but I think robotics, it was more like an epiphany almost. It's like we must consider robotics as part of, processes and daily things that we're doing.
When we spoke a couple of weeks ago or 10 days ago, I think you guys raised a really interesting point about the awareness of the fact that robotics isn't something it's new, or it's like this, it's just associated with the cyborg, or something that's really out there. We've been experiencing robotics for many, many years. And that was a really interesting observation for me. I never really thought about it that way because of the busyness of everything that we're doing and getting caught up with the next big trend and so on. So talk us through a little bit more about the realization that actually human beings are quite familiar with robotics. When you say what you're going to say soon, I'm sure we are all in our respective homes nodding our heads going, actually, he's got a good point. So tell us a bit about our current state of readiness and acceptance of robotics, and how will that increase or decrease maybe as new forms of robots emerge in our consumer world and then in the business world. Talk us through the psychology of that a little bit, if you would, both of you.
Yeah, I could take a first pass at that. I think to your point, I think we've looked at mechanical, robotic automation, in our lives for a lot longer than I think we all realize. I mean, I would argue, the elevator is a robot, right? It's a mechanical tool that you press a button and it does something, and there's no human that actually interacts with it other than you to give it a command and it does something. The same thing as autonomous vehicles, right? How long has cruise control been in cars? That's kind of a first form of autonomous vehicles. So we have a lot of these, again, I go back to when we opened this up and you said, hey, everything's the Jetsons as the robots. That's maybe, that's the end state down the road. But the reality is the incremental steps that we have taken, or even some big leaps we have taken with automation, have been around us, I would say, for decades, if not longer. I mean, let's go back to the steam engine. If we want to, push it back to there, I think you could make that argument. I think what's happening now is that as that automation, to your point of, becomes more customer facing, I think this is when we're getting to an inflection point. So when that robot was, now, yes, an elevator is customer facing. I get it. Someone's going to say that, but as we get to a point where, traditional automation as we see it, so mechanical robots in an auto manufacturing plant, things of that nature, right? Those are in contained environments where you train the labor, you train people get used to it, people understand. Rick, make a great point. Like you're walking through a warehouse and that that automated fork truck is going to come down this aisle, and you don't think twice about it. You move out of the way and there's no one in it, and you're like, okay, that's just part of it. Now, put that environment in the grocery store, And now you've got your 4-year-old and you've got this automated, either it's a SKU counting machine or whatever it may be coming down the aisle. Now it's a little different because of the context. So I think that we are getting to a point where, because we're going to see more of that active automation that stands out, so to speak, in our consumer space, whether it's, I mentioned grocery stores, you see things like FedEx, trying out automated sort of last mile delivery where there'll be no one there, just be sort of this machine that comes to your door and drops stuff off. You look at what Amazon's trying to do with drone delivery, right? All of a sudden, we are going to get much more automation in our faces as consumers. And I think that's going to be very interesting. What is the adoption rate? What is the acceptance of it? Millennials, probably all of us here on this call who are very used to technology will probably be like, okay, that's fine. And I love her to death and she's an incredibly smart woman, but what's my mom going to do? If my mom's in the grocery store and this robot comes up to her, what is she going to do? Is she going to turn around and be like, I'm out of here? Is she going to interact? Is she going to know what it's there to help her with or try to do for her? How is she going to react to it? I think that's the audience we need to, all of us in robotics need to be aware of and to think hard about what is that going to look like when, we stick more of these tools into the wild, and the wild being with us consumers.
Yep. No, another time where I agree with Guy about what he was saying. I would just argue that I would be probably more worried about my mom going to a robot than a robot going to my mom. But it's, just to supplement on what Guy was saying, robotics or some form of automation, yes, has been around us for much longer than we think. We just don't think about it anymore, but on a lot of things. So if you think about the core, say, capabilities or functionalities of what automation or say low-level robotics is, you think about sensing, thinking, or computing, acting. If this is the base, it has been around for a while. Now, what's new with robotics, with what I call digitally enabled robotics, is the capability to also collaborate, communicate, and even with some form of AI, anticipate what's happening. So that's when you can actually, like what Guy was saying, you can actually position robotics and think about robotics in many more operational situations, including situations where you have consumer interaction in a store and people that don't necessarily know either the technology of the machine or have no idea how that works, having something like much more intuitive to work with. That's the collaboration communication part. Collaboration communication also, at system level. Right now, robots that are in some robotic system, they usually work, most of them work somehow in isolation, So now what if you can connect that with a lot of different systems and actually make the experience even better for whomever use them, whether in the business world or industrial world or consumer world. We will see that coming more and more and more. After all, it's just my iPhone is doing a lot of great things. If my iPhone tomorrow is growing legs, will I be so surprised? No. So it's kind of like a natural thing that's happening.
You just talked about something that's very topical related to security. I don't mean cybersecurity, I mean personal security or physical security. And it's being talked about quite a lot recently. ADT, I think, which is a large security firm, I think they got someone took a stake in them. I think it was Google or someone took a significant stake in ADT, some tech titan. It was really interesting and drove up their valuation and stuff. And I was having a conversation with someone recently who's in the physical security space, an ex-intelligence individual. And he was walking me through the advancements in sort of, the tools and technologies, software, different ways of looking at night vision and almost multi sort of level of analysis that you do when you're in the battlefield. And so on and so forth. And then we started to talk about I was talking about robotics, and I was talking about robotics outside of cameras. So if you look at Ring, and you look at the first home drone that Amazon's about to launch, was launched last week. We haven't got it in Europe, but you guys are going to have it in America first. I'm going to trial one of those. So that's the first sort of drone robot, and that's a robot in your house that goes off when there's an intruder, right? And now it's a bit voyeuristic, because I don't know why you'd like to sit somewhere and just sit and watch how the burglar is breaking into your house. Really weird. But anyway, it looks cool and it pops up and it's a little bit like Minority Report, and it's happening. It's all happening now. So What about robotics when it comes to security? I think about the streets outside of my house. I wonder why, because personal safety is so important, why there isn't a physical robot like in the aisle of a shop that is well caged and protected, traveling the streets with cameras all over it, just capturing imagery so people aren't naughty and behave themselves. So, what are your thoughts around that? Is any advancement, any innovation in robotics on the street and secure in terms of security, home and or outside?
Well, I don't know, Avi, you saw there have been some videos, and we talk about COVID, right? And you look at the robotic dog from Boston Scientific, and they had one out in Singapore that was walking around the parks, and it'd go up to people and say, "You're too close, step away," like, move 6 feet apart. And it was people looked at it and were like, "Oh boy, like here we go." But it's coming, and I think now let's we can use some more robot movie references, but RoboCop, right?
RoboCop, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, is that what we're again, philosophical question. We could write a few PhD theses on this. I think if I look right for yourself, like if you look in the UK and all you're doing with CCT cameras, right, you're already having some of that constant 24/7 monitoring. We're starting to see more of that here. Is that the next step? Yeah, is to have a mobile platform called a robot that's going to be walked around the streets, keeping an eye on everything. Do we then take it to the next level where the robot will leverage some AI to make some decisions and say, hey, why are you hanging out the street corner for too long? I'm going to come over here and do something. I think that might be sort of the scary dark side of it. But it's something, there's something there.
Yeah, I would say that I think we're not there yet, and we might actually just to disagree with Guy. Just at least I need to do that once during that show. I think we're not there yet, and we're pretty far away from it, from different perspective. First, like just the pure like physical interaction with some kind of security robots. I mean, something called cobots, collaborative robots, in the industrial space, which is basically more or less a robotic arm at the time, and now it expanded to different things, but a robotic arm that could move around a worker sort of safely. It's only a few years old. So that is in an environment that was caged before. Now you can start to remove the cage and everything because your new best buddy that's working next to you, that used to be Guy, now that's a robot. Guy, I was never worried that Guy would punch me in the face. The robot might, so we need to have all those systems to make it just secure to do a simple task, repetitive task over and over again. We're just there. So now having a robot patrolling around and telling you, hey, you're 6 feet apart. How is that security? You could do that with your phone already. You don't need a robot. What the robot could do is maybe take the people and pull them apart. But then, all the physical security, like having some machine doing something around you, it's pretty complex to put that in place. And I think we're really we're not so close from that. And so that's the technology side of it, and this also the acceptance part of it. I'm not sure I want to actually be policed around by a robot, or have a robot getting out of an automated car and giving me a ticket, because I want to argue with a policeman. I cannot argue with a robot.
Your true motives come forward, Remy.
Exactly.
Remy, we are right in mall situations here where they're having robots that do the patrolling again, and scoot around and patrol and monitor. Now, again, to your point, Remy, it's a enclosed space, it's a controlled environment, it's a mall environment, right? It's not in the middle of the street. But but to Remy's point, I think it becomes also a question of we as citizens, do we accept it, right?
Yeah.
We can have this argument all day long. Hey, we already have given up a lot of privacy. Any of us who carry around an iPhone and Android or all that, and I love the Apple commercials that tell you how we protect your data and your security. I'm like, come on, really? Let's not try to fool us here. But is it a slow burn, right? Is the cell phone, and then do we accept more? I don't know. I think it's an interesting philosophical discussion about where do we go with all this? Where do we allow this to go? Where do we allow this to take us? Because I think, for example, I remember talking to the folks that ran the paramedics team out of Indianapolis, and they were talking about leveraging drones. So now it's not monitoring, but it's sort of the first step where, if there's an emergency, they send the ambulance out, but they'll send a drone out ahead that has basic equipment on it that any one of us could come, and it would give you the instructions like, oh, this person's having a heart attack. Here's a defibrillator, take it out. Here's how you use it, right? So all of a sudden now that's for safety. That's your question about the physical aspect of a robot helping us with safety and security. And that's a great example, but we could definitely see sort of, I think, the flip side where it becomes a little bit intrusive, where again, to Remy's point, I don't want some robot pulling me over. And now it's Judge Dredd type days, right? I don't want.
You know what, Guy? Just to get back onto one of your latest comments, and I think that's actually what robotics is probably meant to do in the near term, is bring more flexibility and more possibility, like in terms of security. We didn't have drones before that could automatically get to some place where an accident happened. All that was complicated. So you can make that cheaper, better, more efficient. So I think that's where robotics will actually supplement maybe first responder or you, if there's clear instruction on how to do that. Can a robot take care of you and I don't know, heal, make you feel better? I possible, but not short term. However, like you said, for safety, but for also a lot of other setup and environment, I think robotics really enabling like more a more nimble approach to everything that we're doing, and enabling new things, basically enabling all of us to do new things. That's where robotics should be right now, and arguably starting to be.
Let's talk about that on a deeper level here. And so I want to remind the audience to send in your questions. If you're tuning in live on YouTube, Facebook, or even on our Zoom call, send in your questions now. And we got first one from Rahul that I think really speaks to the heart of this. So let's get straight talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of robotics right now. So we want to ask you two experts here, what are some of the good things that you're seeing in supply chains that guests could feel, that you guys could feel will actually benefit the supply chains coming forward in the near future? But then also, what are some of the longer term negative ramifications to speak to also that you're concerned about? So what is some of the good, bad, and the ugly that you're seeing in the field right now in terms of supply chain?
Yeah, I'll be self-serving here and talk a little bit about what I'm seeing specifically in my role. I think one of the good things is the ability to leverage and to harmonize sort of automation robotics with the human in the fulfillment channel. And I think what we're seeing is that it's allowing companies to address, all of us here sitting here and listening to this, all of us are making our day jobs harder in supply chain because all of us as consumers are putting way more strain on the supply chain than it was ever built for. I think we're seeing automation really not necessarily solve it because there's no, it's always a constantly moving target. But I feel like automation is certainly what I'm seeing today is helping meet those needs, but also provide the flexibility to meet those needs, right? I think what's really interesting about some of the automation we're seeing today, as opposed to, I would say, automation 10, 15 years ago, is that because it can operate, and Remy sort of touched on this, right, independently, it can operate and interact in its own. It can do things on its own. It's giving the warehouse, for example, tremendous flexibility it didn't have before, as opposed to going in and rip and replacing all your warehouse infrastructure and putting in hard automation. Now you can augment what you already have, and I think that's a good positive from the standpoint of reducing the friction in our supply chain. I think at the end of the day, we're always trying to reduce friction in the supply chain. I think the negative is, like we talked about, is there's times where it crosses over, and my negative, and this is maybe my little soapbox too on this, is, we talk a lot about the robots and helping with gamification and things of that nature. When I look at gamification, it's a cute, fun name that, my 5-year-old would get. But when you look at it, there is a bit of a deep, darker side to it, which is, hey, I'm putting everybody's name up on a big board and it's all scoring. Well, guess what? That also shows me who the bottom feeders are and who I can go out and say, you know what? You 3 weren't very good. I'm going to fire you. And it's almost reducing the human aspect to a mechanical measure, which I think is very dangerous.
Yep. I think those are great point, Guy. I would say my perspective, like the good, and specifically when it comes to supply chain, I think it's Guy and I will be making the same point. It just enable probably to do a lot more things, to have more nimble supply chain. So to basically like have serve, whether it's consumer or not, but serve like people better and make sure that you get the right thing when you need it. So we're talking about security and first responder. Even if that's not as dramatic as that, it will just enable us to like keep having what's necessary around us. That's say the good part of robotics. The bad part of robotics, I think, is it will actually keep leveling up the expectation, especially from a consumer perspective. I mean, a few months ago, it was hard to find toilet papers or anything. And it was, I mean, people were just like, oh my God, is it possible to actually that a store could miss something? And it's not just one store, it's every store. I think it was in the UK about a year ago. There were like some kind of shortage about some sort of vegetables. Same thing as people were shocked. I mean, in shock because not used to that anymore. Well, yes, hang on. Those vegetables are hard to find. It's not the season. So, live with that. So it's basically like it's all the dark side of consumerism, if you like, that I think might get like, push to an edge that's not necessarily where we want to be, and like create expectations that are not the same. In the meantime, also like the good and the bad is like robotics, it's great. It's a great, fast moving industry, create tons of jobs, and a lot of more people than me now are talking about robotics, and that's fantastic. In the meantime, it also kind of create like new or future tech titans. Like basically, if you are equipped with robotics, if you can equip yourself at scale, well, you start to get an advantage that other don't have, and you basically like make the world much more binary. So it's basically either you're Amazon or you're not. Robotics, like everyone usually talks about robotics, especially in the warehouse and supply chain environment, by mentioning Amazon. It's either you're Amazon or you're not. And I think it's, somehow I'm calling that bad in the sense that, well, we want to see new player coming in, actually changing the game. I hope it won't be Google or Amazon that will actually reign over robotics, but there will be some new companies. So it's like, I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad or ugly, but it's probably like actually getting the world into really kind of black and white situation, which I don't think it's necessarily best for a lot of reasons.
Have they, these days we're talking about unemployment and the rise of AI and its role on jobs. And one school of thought is, oh no, that's all rubbish. All these people who are going to be impacted by AI are going to do better jobs, bigger jobs. They'll be retrained and so on. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is, well, not quite. There are a lot of people who are unable to learn Python and new data science tools and software. Not everyone's wired to do those technology related jobs. What are they going to end up doing? Hence the conversation around universal income, basic income and so on. So what's the word on the street around the rise of robotics and its impact on jobs? I totally get the point that the factory, the 21st century factory, to what you said earlier, and where Rick is spending a lot of his time these days in quite an impressive robotics-driven factory with one of his clients. And there are not many people around. Unlike 15 or 20 years ago, you would have seen loads of people knocking widgets or relying on some, the hand robots or the single-purpose robots. And now there's sort of collab robots. There's the Kiva running around and all sorts of stuff. So what's the because you're talking about negative things. Let me pose one provocative point. Some people feel that robotics, along with AI, is basically going to destroy the whole concept of employment, and people won't have anything to do because robots are doing it. Heck, the drones are going to take away the delivery driver's job. Not all of them, but many of them. So what is your view on it? Because it is something that's worrying people, especially right now because of the situation we're in.
Yeah, I think it's another topic where we can actually write a couple of PhDs on. But I'd say, well, it's you have to think about it from a different perspective. The first one is just like, okay, it's technology moving forward and like advancing and everything. Well, do we still worry about the people who lost their job because they knew how to operate a telegraph? Probably not. It's the same kind of things. Like, okay, it will be moving to a different class of technology that will enable different things. If you were lagging already in your skill sets, well, it will be even more apparent. So yes, you might suffer. That's the way it is, but it's not robots or robotics. It's technology. It's advanced in everything. Same thing. If you don't have a driving license, doesn't matter how great the car is, right? It's exactly the same thing. And now, like, if you think about robotics and why robotics and AI are actually bringing good things, it's because we are seeing, a lot of people are seeing robotics. Well, you named it, actually. It's an arm. It's something moving around. It's like, it's something that, so far only us humans could really do. AI, it's artificial intelligence. Doesn't matter what it actually is. We call it with the term that is actually make it like something human. So, well, it's like, are we creating extra human that could actually be much better than we are? And that's worrying. Like, we don't, no one wants to feel obsolete. It's just human nature, I would say. In the meantime, you also mentioned something about, is it really about losing your job, or is it about losing your income? I would love to be paid for nothing. I mean, I don't mind if a robot take my job, just don't take my income. It's you were talking about like universal income. That's kind of, I mean, I don't know if that's the solution, but at the end of the day, what we're worrying about is like, can we have a roof over our head? Can my daughter go to school and be fed and those kind of things? That's important. Now, will the job be done by a robot and AI or something? Why should I care? I mean, and by the way, I do personally believe that the human beings have that sense of creativity and anticipation and everything that will not necessarily be replaced anytime soon. So, long live the human beings.
Yeah, I think there's, you just go back through all the industrial revolutions. You go back through all the, rise of the steam engine, rise of the telephone, rise of the internet. And there was always this fear. I like to be optimistic on it. Like you said, like, I think as humans, and we sort of started with this conversation around sort of that human aspect. I think we as humans will continue to find employment, find income, and robots and automation and technology is still going to be a tool that we use, just like a hammer or a saw. But I also understand, like, because it is this this digital aspect, or as Lemmy said, sort of a robot that starts to look like a human. It's also human nature to start putting two and two together and figuring out, wait a minute, that's going to replace what I'm doing. I mean, I think we have the same issues when you talk to people that are accountants or lawyers, and they say, wait a minute, like, if we use this thing we call AI, and we just have the all of the law process digitized, why need a lawyer? Just go search case law and just put it up on the computer, and there you go, you're all set. So I absolutely understand why there's fear, and I think about it all the times too. It's I have conversations with some people who are very smart and capable, who say, why don't we need a salesperson? I just price everything online, and person plugs these numbers, and boom, off they go. And it's like, maybe for some things it works, but the reality is you still need that human contact. There's still that subtlety that I'm hopeful, maybe more hopeful than I believe, that our automation, our robots, our AI will never catch up with. Maybe it will. Maybe we reach singularity, and then then we are in trouble. But I certainly think that in the near term, I certainly look at it as, automation will definitely take jobs away. There's no doubt. But it also create other jobs. It also create other industries. It'll also create other opportunities to make that income.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that point too. That adaptability is just part of our nature, and that's what's going to happen. And let me ask you this as we're winding down here. For those interested in this field, the entrepreneurs out there, the graduates, the postgraduates, all of those on the cutting edge that are fascinated by robotics in this field, what advice would you have for them as they're entering this new and exciting field?
I mean, I sort of mentioned being at Forrester in the late 90s when the .com boom happened. So I think there's a lot of parallels and similarities. And I think anybody who's interested in the space, first, I say, jump right in. I think it's a really interesting space. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I also think it's like everything in technology, right? Don't fall in love with the actual technology itself. Think of what the use case is. What's the value it brings back? I look at some of the most successful, robotic use cases. It's for simple things like what? Like mopping the floor. Okay. Hey, a robot can do that really well. And all of a sudden it brings value because I can take an FTE out. I can do it more consistently. Right. It could be conceived that's not cool, that technology, but it's a very practical thing that the robot can do. So I think for anybody who's interested, it's like all technologies, right? Don't fall too in love with the technology itself, but keep looking at the business cases of what it's solving and why it makes sense. I'll give you guys one example. I remember talking to Caterpillar many years ago, right? And they sell these massive earth movers. and for millions of dollars. And I remember he was telling me the same thing. He's like, I remember he was out in a place, I think it was in India, and he was trying to sell this. And the guy looked at him and said, listen, I can hire labor for like 2 cents a day. What do I need this? Right. So again, think of the business case. Why is this appealing to your customer or their value prop? Don't fall in love with the technology. Technology is cool. Don't lose that, but don't fall in love just with technology.
Yeah, I think you made a great point here about like don't fall in love with technology. I kind of like it. I would say, and I will go along the same line actually. That will also be my advice for people getting in robotics, and they don't have to be young, by the way. It can be anyone at any age. It's not so complicated. But I would say don't think through the robots. Think through robotics. That's what I was saying at the beginning, and think outside the box. Don't try to actually get into robots as part of robotics to just do something all better. Think about like what Guy was mentioning is think about what you can, the outcome of using robots and robotics in a certain setup and create something new. One kind of example that I use very often is what I call the case for electricity. When the world, like the manufacturing world, moved from steam powered devices to electricity powered ones. At the time, to have like steam power coming to all devices, you had to have the source of power and all the devices around to be very, very centralized around that. Okay, when we moved to electricity, there were like an inherent benefit to do that, like 10-15% better, like more efficiency, because you don't have to clean the machine on. But the first factories, they were exactly built the same way the robots are being used today. They were just like, they were taking like an electricity, like a plug or something, and just like building all the machine around. And it took another generation of people that were not coming from that era to think, well, what about all those machineries? We pull them together one after the other, the same way we have our processes working. And that all of a sudden, we started to like have improvement in efficiency, in possibility that were nowhere seen before. And I think this is where robotics still needs to go. So for people who wants to join robotics, first, I think it's fantastic to work for robotics. Bring on new ideas. Don't think about the robot. Think about what you can do with that. Be the case for robotics, like it was the case for electricity at the time. Bring on new things.
And my final question, again, because you're giving some fantastic responses, does one have to be trained in computer science? Do you have to be good at maths? What's the gig? Like, can you just go into robotics? Let's say you finish a master's or an MBA and you're like, I want to go into robotics. I think it's fascinating. I love Hollywood movies. I've read 3 books on it, but I can't code, So it's a simple question, but it's a real one. It's a practical question. Can anyone go into robotics?
Hey, I have a degree in political science, so I guess the answer is yes.
Okay.
You heard it here from our experts, folks.
Yeah, well, and I would concur with that. Yes, absolutely. Actually, come over into robotics, especially if you don't know how to code. If you know how to code, you might know too well to code, and you might have boundaries and not see what's possible. So please come in robotics if you have no idea what robotics is. It's even better.
Yeah, well, there's one question that's come in. Sorry, I must ask it in the last 2 minutes or 1 minute, and maybe we need to talk about this offline. But it is a question about, from Matteo, how should we think about the regulation of the code that underpins robotics?
Whoa, that's
a last easy question for you guys.
Yeah, wow.
Exactly. Yes, in 1 minute each. You mean in some form of like the same way AI is viewed at potentially being biased in the way it's used. That's exactly the same. I mean, the algorithms that are, commanding robots many of them are now AI based. So the same thing is like take into consideration the entire environment and keep like adding to it in order to make sure that what the robots will do, like whatever action they're doing, are not either biased. So that's pretty, that could be dramatic sometimes, but also just don't make mistake because that could like hurt people or do something wrong. So just about like don't think about it about robotics as and AI is the same as like some kind of like closed fence system. Think about it as something that could ingest data and actually act upon it, but that will always look around at new type of data that could actually feed the system to get even better, to get better and better. That would be my very 1 minute short answer.
Yeah,
it's a good one.
Agree with Remy on that. And I think the other one, and you know, we don't have time, but I think it's not just the underlying nature of the code, but then it's the information, right? I think I look at robots in the robotics space. Robots are a tremendous consumer of data, but they're also a tremendous producer of data. And then, you know, now we go right back into that question of data privacy and what do we do with that? So I think it's also another thing that, you know, anyone who wants to get into robotics, again, to your questions earlier, you know, I think because of that, these are becoming issues that are beyond just, you know, engineers, robotic engineers. I think there's plenty of space in the pool to jump on in, but I think it's helpful to have folks, to Remy's point too, that have that other perspective, because we are going to have to address these issues. They're here already, and they're going to continue to be there. And I think you have to have some, you know, critical thinking from different places to. There's no right or wrong answer, but I think that just to constantly push and ask and try to find some kind of answer as we move forward.
Well, we want to thank you both for joining our show today, Straight Talk Live. And where can Guy and Remy, where can people find out more about you and your work?
For me, just look me up on LinkedIn. So, you know, first name Guy, last name Courtin, or I'm on Twitter at G Courtin, so GCOURTIN, and just hit me up on those two. I'd be happy to chat.
Yeah, well, same here. I'm on LinkedIn. Gleisner, spelled Glaisner, and Remy, first name Remy. It's all around you on your portal for StraightTalk.Live. Sorry, so people are just free to come and contact us. I guess we'll be very happy to hear from them.
Fantastique. Merci, mes amis.
Merci.
And just a really quick recap for next week, same time, we're going to have our first return guest in Dr. John DeMartini, one of the leading human behavior experts out there. And really, you know, something that we all have to navigate as humans, and especially in these times, how do we actually overcome fear? What are some of the practical ways to do that? And I know Dr. John DeMartini is going to offer some really practical tips that speak deeply and give real tools that you can take away. So come join us next week. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. And until then, we bid you adieu. And merci to everyone out there.
Adieu. Thank you, Rick and F.
Thank you both.
Hey guys,
With you guys.
all the best.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful
Okay.
day.
Bye.
Cheers.
Go do good, everyone out there. Stop